most of us are not very good at thinking. If I had to pin down one biggest problem that results in the worst things in the world, it's bad thinking. It's people who incorrectly reason what the best thing to do is, then they act on those beliefs. You can point to most of the worst atrocities, the worst dictators in history. They thought they were doing good things. They had bad beliefs and in many ways good intentions, but they had this warped reasoning and very often a disconnect between reasoning about how to achieve goals in the world. If we could teach wisdom to people, I think that would inherently create a much better world that would flow to so many different areas. The problem is we're just not innately that interested in wisdom, most of us. And so we have to find ways to make it interesting. Welcome to the Mindform podcast, where we delve into the minds of some of the most interesting people on the planet, discuss psychology, philosophy, and personal growth, and share the wisdom we uncover with you. Join us as we explore the art of forming our minds. Here's your host, Frank Lawton.
Kia ora from New Zealand. Welcome to another episode of the Mindform podcast, an extension of the Mindform collective and training platform. This podcast is similarly a space dedicated to exploring and altering psychological landscapes together. In each episode, I speak with a new guest, a member of Mindform, to extract wisdom, refine ideas, and collaborate on the game of architecting our minds. This week, we have Ryan on again, based in North Carolina.
God,
I wrote North Colorado, man. I mix up those two states. Anyway,
it's amazing.
Ryan is the founder of Mindform, of course. He's best-selling author of 3 books, including Designing the Mind and Become Who You Are. Ryan has a vision to make the world a wiser place. His books, the Mindform community, and everything else he's working on serves this mission. He has a few projects in the works that we've talked about on here before, and today I want to go deep into why and how we can create more wisdom in the world. How you doing, Ryan? Yeah, my pleasure. It's always good to catch up about this stuff. Often our calls are businessy, so it's nice to get into the fun bits. Actually, you're a bit frozen at my end. Nope, you're good. You're back. Shouldn't be an issue. So yeah, let's just start with that. I'll just start with that question. Why and how are you trying to make the world a wiser place?
It's a big question, but I think wisdom is a huge overlooked common element in many of the problems we see in the world today. Mm-hmm. We tend to focus on the symptoms of a lot of these problems, and I think we're not good enough about looking at the root. And eventually, very often you find that root is in mental habits in individual minds that are perpetuated through culture and societal systems. And if we actually step back and look at those actual mental habits and we start breaking down what wisdom actually is instead of just viewing it as this vague spiritual notion, I think we can actually start making huge progress in changing those habits in individual minds, and also starting to ask, well, how could we change how we structure society to be more conducive to those individual habits and bringing about just greater flourishing on a mass scale, right? Because there's no principle of human nature that I am aware of that actually prevents a world where most of us are happy most of the time and like getting along and all these things, but it's not the default. It's going to require a kind of transhuman approach to modifying human nature, modifying the human mind, and modifying society on a global scale to bring those kind of changes about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it would certainly take, based on that, it's difficult to imagine, perhaps, because we haven't seen it before. Such a world, I think, it takes an approach that's not been taken before, perhaps. It takes responding to causes, putting the pressure on the points that haven't had pressure on them before. So what's the how, Ryan? What's the way that you're trying to have your impact on that?
Is an important first, here's a trick for imagining a much better world: is figure out, do some research and understand what life was like, say, 50,000 years ago, back before civilization existed, when we lived in hunter gatherer tribes. Understand that world, and then look at the world we see today. And what you'll find is that there are benefits to the world we see today that are much better than the world from 50,000 years ago. And there are also benefits to the world 50,000 years ago, our tribal ancestors, that we don't have today. And so if you just combine the best aspects of today with the best aspects of our Pleistocene existence, you end up with a pretty good world, right? There's no infant mortality is pretty good, and predation is not like a huge issue. We're not getting killed by wild animals all the time. We also don't have obesity and the extreme mental health issues that you see today, and drug addiction. Like, so many parts of the modern world add new problems. So if we could just combine stuff we already figured out, millennia and millennia and millennia ago, with what we figured out now, we'd be in great shape. The other thing I'll say about imagining is a problem that I see in the modern world is so many people are reluctant to even imagine what a better world would look like. You get the word utopian, and then suddenly people are like, "Oh, that's naive. That's unrealistic. We don't even need to think about that." And it's an absurd idea, really, because you wouldn't approach any other endeavor to improve something without having a clear idea of where you were trying to get to, right? You wouldn't just go blind into a problem you were trying to solve. And yet most of us go blind into politics and having opinions on society, and saying, oh, it should be this way and not that way. But they haven't ever thought about what would the end goal actually look like. You have to have an understanding of point A and point B in order to effectively navigate from A to B. And so I think we could actually use a lot more realistic, pragmatic utopianism in the world. So there's all that, and then you asked how, and there are.
Hold on, I want to get into a bit of what you've said.
Yeah.
Respond to a bit of what you said. I mean, I'm absolutely with you, and it does seem sometimes it's amusing how arbitrary it really is. I mean, in both the ways that you mentioned, but another as well. I mean, certainly it's funny how passionate we are about improving our lot, but how we very rarely is it the case that we have a clear idea of what the good lot is that we want. That just seems strange. But also, you look at media and books, and we certainly entertain very often exercises in how bad the world could be. We do a lot of imagining of futures, some interesting futures, certainly, terrible futures, absolutely. I mean, Star Trek's the only positive future I can think of that was sort of in popularish media. But I think that has an impact. We're in a generation, certainly, of people who absorb a heck of a lot of what look like predictions about the future of the human race. And whilst it's valuable commentary, these dystopian, sort of, and science fiction and such type books and films and TV shows, it's why do we do all that and seem to just actively exclude positive imaginings from that process? That's something that baffles me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's like fair enough, because historically, the dystopia is a lot more likely than the utopia. We haven't figured out a single point in history how to sustain a utopia, but we found a lot of horrible ways of structuring society. So it kind of makes sense that people would jump there, but also none of that means that it's like impossible to achieve something much better. And also it's definitely not how you get to where you want to go, is just not thinking about it and thinking about the worst case scenario. So no, I'm with you. There should be a lot more thinking on this topic.
Well, that's another thing, but it's a generalizable phenomenon, really, outside of just thinking about society in the future, people in general seem to have this impression that any effort towards a positive end, even the small amount of effort of considering it possible and imagining it, is that there's some harm in putting that effort in if it's unlikely to get the outcome. I often have um, interactions with people where I talk about, oh, let's try this. How would this go? How would this go? And it's an idea with risks that you sort of work through in the conversation, you know. But having the conversation itself can be scary for people. With if there's any risk involved, and I think that's a big part of the utopia. It's like, oh well, it's I guess highly likely based on history that we'll get it wrong repeatedly in our efforts to move in that direction. But that seems to make people think that, well, it's not that painful to talk about it, is it? I mean, perhaps a lot of us, and this is where wisdom comes in, maybe, perhaps a lot of us have such habits of thought that trying towards something and hoping for something and then not getting it straight away is just too painful. But it really, objectively, it's fine to fail in that regard.
Agreed. It is that there is a reluctance to try to do something that will be unlikely. And there's another thing you kind of touched on, which is like there's a binary thinking to it too. It's like either we achieve with dystopia, there's so many ways to do it wrong, but with a good world, it's like either we get it perfect or it was unrealistic, we failed, right? Like there is a spectrum of good to bad. Like you can make things better. You know, and this is, I think, another one of those tendencies that prevents people from really getting into these topics is they try to come up with a better world, better systems or something. And then they responsibly ask themselves like, okay, but how could that be gamed? How could that be beat? How could that go wrong? And they can think of ways and they can be like, yeah, no, you could do this and you could do this. And then they throw their hands up and say, oh, okay, it's impossible. And in reality, like, yeah, there probably always are going to be bad apples and negative outcomes in society, but that doesn't mean we can't get better. Like if you can come up with a system that is just 10% better than a system we have today, that's an improvement. That's worth thinking about and ideating.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's also all you need to worry about because you're never going to get to, no problems. Let's say that's possible. You're never going to get to no problems from a million problems without just ticking down a little bit. So you might as well set your goal to just that next step in less problems or more goodness. You know, just set that as your goal and focus on that. But I think people are like, well, what's the point? It's not a worthy goal. And you're so right about there's the sentiment that there's an infinite amount of ways, literally an infinite amount of ways to get it wrong and one way to get it right. And if it's not that one way, it's wrong. And that's a bit absurd in my taking. Every situation, I suppose, has things about it that are nice and cool and good and things about it that aren't great and are bad and unpleasant. And you just want to have a situation which has a preferable ratio there.
Absolutely. I think we could do a lot better. That's the big takeaway.
All right. How then?
How then? That's a very good question. So there are a few different grouping. So I try to be a systems thinker and a systems designer, and that means that we're not just dealing with problems in a linear way. We're living in a world where problems, one thing causes another, but then that thing that was caused feeds back into the original thing, and then there's thousands of other variables all intertwined and feeding back into one another. And so you can't really change one thing without changing others. This is one of the things that makes it daunting, but we can certainly take an effort to improve individual minds, right? We can certainly do what I've done so far, mostly in my books, which is try to give people the tools and the resources needed to build better minds, build better mental habits, become better people, right? Better thinking tools, less biased ways of reasoning, better emotion regulation skills, better self-control. If we look at a lot of the negative outcomes we see in the world, they ultimately go back to these sort of unrefined habits, right? There are people who can't control their emotions. They're suffering really unnecessarily. Like there's probably a lot of necessary suffering out there, but there's probably even more unnecessary suffering that if we just could teach people what to do when you're dealing with that type of suffering, you could eliminate it. And of course, individual suffering affects other individuals. There are people committing awful acts out there because they are not happy when they actually could be if they knew the right skill. There's people who can't control their actions and behaviors and desires, and that has a negative effect on everyone else too. And worst of all, I think most of us are not very good at thinking, and no one's got it perfect. No one's like a true critical thinker, but there are absolutely tools to mitigate bias, to reduce motivated bias. And I think if I had to pin down one biggest problem that results in the worst things in the world, it's bad thinking. It's people who incorrectly reason what the best thing to do is, and then they act on those beliefs. And so, you can point to most of the worst atrocities, the worst dictators in history. They thought they were doing good things. They had bad beliefs and in many ways good intentions, but they had this warped reasoning and very often a disconnect between reasoning about how to achieve goals in the world, and what would actually be rewarding internal. So kind of an internal, you combine internal and external reasoning, you kind of get wisdom as far as I'm concerned. The means and the ends of action, that's wisdom. And so if we could teach wisdom to people, I think that would inherently create a much better world. That would flow to so many different areas. The problem is, like, we're just not innately that interested in wisdom, most of us. And so we have to find ways to make it interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that does seem like it's funny that something that's so universally fundamental to everyone's well-being and functioning, and also universally admired when people reach the heights of it, wisdom, right? I mean, everyone celebrates those iconic characters of wisdom, Nelson Mandela, Abe Lincoln, whoever, right? It's funny that that's the case, and yet it seems to be like a kind of niche hobby for weirdos. For a very small section of the populace. I think certainly part of that issue is just enculturation. In fact, I think we enculturated out of interest in that. That's my take. As someone who's always been curious about that, I found that the reactions of schooling and adults can often be dismissive to that field of interest. Yeah, but that's perhaps just my personal experience.
That's an interesting point. I don't know. I don't know if I see a lot of kids who are really interested in, even like before they've been, pushed into the school system, interested in like, how can I avoid this negative experience next time? We naturally learn it to a certain level just by trial and error. And then, yeah, you might be right. We might be conditioned out of it, or it might be that too much wisdom is actually not good for our genes from an evolutionary standpoint. And so being too thoughtful, too metacognitively aware, reasoning too much about what would actually make you happier versus just naturally trusting your desires to do that. Probably we've been optimized not to do that too much. And so, yeah, it is the rare weirdo like me. I was probably 5 or 10 years ago that I first met another person my age who was interested in like actually understanding wisdom and how to operate your own mind better. And yeah, it is kind of a weird thing to be obsessed with in our current culture. And it's probably a combination. Probably culture doesn't help. And that's kind of what I'm saying. Well, if our natural tendencies, our evolutionary wiring isn't inclined toward wisdom, then that's going to result in our culture not being optimized for wisdom, which is going to feed back into our brains and so on and so on. And so if we don't find a leverage point at some point in that process, where we can jump in and actually inject this stuff and make it rewarding, make it more immediately interesting, then it's just not going to get incorporated. Oh.
And what's that leverage point? What leverage point are you pushing down on?
Well, again, there's the leverage point of trying to just actually teach these things in ways that are more interesting. I've taken a different approach, I think, to the kind of self-help genre where you make it appealing to an individual. It's not just an intellectual curiosity. This is your life that's going to benefit, but you give it a kind of brand, you give it a techie aesthetic, you make it more clear that this can be a fun, interesting thing, right? This doesn't have to be like, oh, mental health. It's like a stigmatized thing. It can be more like fitness, right? And I've done the same thing with the Mindform community. I've tried to make it a coveted membership and it's not for people who have mental health problems necessarily. Of course, everyone's welcome, but it's people who are trying to grow, get stronger, get better in terms of their mind and their wisdom and ultimately live better lives. So there's all that, of course, and that extends to the programs too. I mean, pretty much all anxiety education, for example, out there is very much centered around, treating this neurosis. It's either these little self-help hacks or it's like, oh, you've got a serious disorder. You have to go to a therapist or get medication. And there's not really this other option that's kind of like, well, what if you can learn these principles that work on your own? You can just proactively try to build a better and better mind that becomes less and less vulnerable to these problems that are going to affect you your entire life otherwise. Um, so yeah, there are all these things that I've tried to create so far, and then there are a lot bigger things really that I'm working to build up to. I've talked a little bit on here about the Mindform app that we've designed versions of that we're working to fund and develop pretty soon here. And then I think I've also talked about Mindform centers. And to be honest, I'm having to really scrutinize, what people will do and how you actually make it engaging for people. Because, for example, like these Mindform centers, I see them having a lot of space for people to sit and collaborate and take programs on touchscreens and also have some workout equipment and maybe some spa things. Basically, be an all-in-one self-optimization membership where you can go whenever you want and just work on yourself. And I'm asking myself, okay, well, will people use this according to its intention? Will they work on these programs? Will they collaborate together and try to achieve greater accountability in their personal growth goals? Will they work on upgrading their minds, or will they use it as a gym and co-working membership? Because again, we're so programmed to value our bodies and our work over our minds and our wisdom. And so how do we give people what they will actually be much happier if we give it to them, when again we're just wired to overlook it?
That's tricky, man, because sometimes as someone with that interest, right? So I try to bring that into like my church, for example, a little bit. Like I'm organizing done a few tramps, and I'm actually heading off on one this evening for that sort of purpose. Like, okay, crafting out space for people to build their wisdom and their their spiritual growth and all of that, which isn't always the mode that at least the majority is interested in that space, as with many others, sort of going deep, doing the work and all of that. And I often find that there's this perception that I almost have to kind of sell wisdom to people, or sell self-development to people. Maybe, maybe, and the feeling can be that that it's not something people are naturally interested in, so I almost have to trick them into being interested in it. And I've sort of stepped back from that way of perceiving it because it's a bit tiring and disheartening. Um, but I guess I wonder, just based on what you're saying, it sounds a little bit like you see it that way, and that's not a critique. But is that how you feel, that we're in a world of people who don't care for that, and we kind of need to trick people into caring about that? Or is it that everyone does, but you just got to find that part of them that does, and help it to flourish? What's your take there?
Good question. Yeah, it's come for the pizza and stay for the wisdom, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I've used the phrase sometimes to describe my challenge is selling wisdom to a world that doesn't want it. And ultimately, I think it's one of those things that if we really kind of optimize the world for it, it wouldn't have to be an obsession. People wouldn't have to want it necessarily. I've said before, like, psychotecture kind of wouldn't be necessary in an ideal world because you wouldn't get that far in your life without just being infused with it. Right now,
Right.
kids don't want to go to school, right? They don't want to learn math, but they still learn it, right? And so if
Yep,
we
that's
had
true.
similar
That's fun.
institutions where you do just innately learn these things, they're just instilled in you either through community, through software, through teachers and mentors, right? If every part of our life were optimized for wisdom, you wouldn't have to personally want to explore it, and you would just benefit from it. You would have a better life. We would have a better world. And so that does kind of bring us to this other question of, okay, well, there's the optimizing individual mind society, or minds component, and then there's the society component. How could we change institutions such that that feeds into our minds and back into society and so on? And of course, it's never one or the other. It's all the components, but you kind of have to ask this for each one. How could we change things so that it were much better for them?
Well, what are some of your ideas? I'll tell you one of mine. Um, but that's been coming up for me a lot recently. I recently watched. This is such a tangent, but I recently watched the film version of Matilda the musical. You know Matilda, the Roald Dahl book about the little girl who's super bright and everything. And it's really, I mean, it's really a story about the importance and preciousness of childhood and the impact that abuse versus compassion has in that context. And that's always stuck as very important and impactful to me as someone who grew up in two very different kinds of homes simultaneously. And I guess I just noticed the contrast and how much it matters. And I suppose the idea that comes out is how do we support that environment? I mean, that's what builds us, right? So I mean, there's culture, there's school, there's media, there's many aspects of culture that impact us substantially. But of course, our primary relationships and the people we spend the vast majority of time with in our most formative years has a profound impact on us. And most of us, I'm sure you can relate, on the journey of accumulating wisdom, know that part of that journey is a bit of unlearning of how you adapted in that earlier context, and you realize the impact of that as you're on that wisdom journey. And so I think, okay, how do we change that environment for young people? And it's interesting because it's a most important context, but it's also, in a way, a most unethical place to intervene with the state, at least, for example, right? Like, you don't want to get into eugenics, telling people who can have kids and who not. I think that's been tried before, and it was pretty evil and bad. So how do you do that? And I've had ideas, around perhaps we create just free resources, and people can get funded to like courses and stuff, and new parents can get the funding and the time off work paid to go and take those. And I'm sure that would be a net positive for society. So many people go into parenting, they just don't have the skill sets, they don't have anything to support their child to have a healthy, not just healthy, but wise, flourishing, happy, um, competent sort of way of operating in the world. And that's what kids need. They need an early context that can provide those tools. So yeah, that's something that I think is a really, really potent leverage point. There's a lot of leverage there. Um, but yeah, what do you think of?
I think that's a great point, and I think I do often overlook that area because, like you said, it's pretty hard to intervene and standardize like how parents raise their kids, right?
Yeah, you
I
don't
think,
want to as well, really. You don't want to standardize it too much because
yeah,
what if you're wrong, eh? Yeah.
right. But I love that idea. I think definitely creating yeah, free resources, and then maybe even some kind of reward, some kind of incentive
I
system
agree.
for parents to
Or you get to
actually.
do that instead of go to work and you get paid to do it or something like that.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. Or yeah, it's paid leave from work to take your parenting training programs. I mean,
Mm.
that's a simple implementable. I mean, getting that kind of thing like passed is one challenge, but we can at least imagine that happening. Um, yeah, and I guess part of the challenge with it too is like, okay, well, we've got an education system where people are in for generally at least 18 years of their life. Um, Surely we could incorporate the parenting education into that. I mean, maybe they're not at that age at a point where they're ready to be thinking about that. But there's that. Then there's like personal finance, right? That's not something most people are taught, and most people are really bad with money, right? Um, then there's we get to the same topics that I've been mentioning, and it's kind of like you have to ask, well, why is none of this the wisdom, the self control? Why is none of this taught in schools? And of course, it's because schools are a part of a larger system that's not optimized for that. Right? If a school started teaching parenting skills and money skills and wisdom and citizenship and all these things, the results in terms of metrics that society cares about would be it would have lower standardized test scores and GPAs and lower college admission. And if a college emphasized these things, it would have lower employment and uh, and lower salaries. So if this is what society is built around,
It
uh,
all comes back to the shareholder class in a way, doesn't it? Because you track that all the way up. Well, what determines employment? It's the management decision, and what determines that? The shareholders.
really does, and that's what I come back to as well. That's why raising funding for an app and these things is a little more challenging because you can't just go and borrow money and promise to people that they'll make a profit because as soon as you take that kind of money, you've put the first nail in the coffin of your mission, right? You have made profitability always have to be your number one North Star. Every other aspect of your mission is it's just a PR stunt at that point because you have to serve your shareholders first. And so yes, that fundamental sort of economic system underlies all these difficulties in actually incorporating things that would be good for humans. And so I'm always asking myself, what would a human-centered rather than a capital-centered society look like? So here's one example of how that could look, because just another point here, people not only get caught in the binary of have we designed a perfect world or not, in which case we failed, um, they get caught in the binary of two different economic or government systems. It's like it's either capitalism or communism.
Absurd.
It's
Absurd.
either democracy or authoritarianism. There are a lot of options. Part of what I want to do in the sort of first work of on society that I put out is say like there's 1,000 ways to do it. So instead of thinking about, oh, my side versus the other side on this issue, let's think about like society number 735 out of all the options we have. Could this one be like the winning one? And so one idea that I often reflect on and think would be imperfect but better is a world where economics are sort of run by a value-based free market instead of a desire-based free market. In other words, instead of voting with your wallet and your behaviors, which we know can be manipulated very easily, people vote on industries based on, a kind of higher self-evaluation. So you actually ask them what they value. You have them vote and sort of rank different services and where they fall. And I think one of the effects of this is things would line up much more closely with what we actually value. So, for example, yeah, go ahead. I know I haven't fully explained the concept yet.
No, okay, I'll let you finish and then I'll ask my questions, but I've got a few already.
Right. So in a situation like this, a company, like let's say a social media company, would not be able to be the wealthiest company in the world because it would be voted when people actually reflect on what adds value to their life. They would actually rank social media pretty low. Most people agree, like, this doesn't add to my life. It probably takes away from it. But because we have an economic system that's just really centered around how people behave and what they desire, these advertisement-based platforms are able to thrive. Now, what you're probably kind of wondering about is how this voting would actually translate to, economic changes.
That is
And
it.
yeah, so you hear talk, and some countries do this effectively, where certain industries get taxed at a much higher rate because they aren't good for people. But this is generally more of a case by case thing. And then you have the opposite case too. You have government subsidies for things we occasionally decide are good for the world. But what if this were fundamentally how it worked? What if we had a dues system that, in proportion to what people voted was the most valuable to them and the least valuable, either increasingly taxed or increasingly subsidized, where you have a full spectrum and a threshold in the middle where everything below it is increasingly getting taxed, or we could just call it a dues system, that everything below it pays dues and everything above it receives dues, such that you get the most funding if you're really serving what people perceive as true value, and you get the least, and in fact probably can't even sustain your business if you're very low on that list in terms of
It's
what
funny.
people perceive as harming them.
You can easily imagine the impact of that. You sit down in your boardroom with your shareholders, and we're like, "Oh crap, we're getting taxed so bad. How can we make it at least that the majority of people perceive us as being good for society?" And you can't avoid, in some ways, improving the ethics of your business practice.
We'll actually
You
have
want
to
to
make things
consider that.
better for humans.
Yeah, yeah,
What a
yeah.
crazy idea. And I think many of the cynics listening to this uh will be saying, like, well, companies can misinform. They're already doing this. I mean, there are whole
Very much so.
marketing campaigns to manipulate people into thinking like climate change isn't happening and fossil fuels are great, and tobacco, that one seems to have mostly lost, but like tobacco is actually good for you. And and yes, again, this falls into the category of, no, the problem wouldn't be permanently and perfectly solved. But everywhere that you're able to influence and improve and make things less likely, that's an improvement. If you're able to, instead of fighting with fire with fire with a lot of the bad actors in society, if you're able to fight fire by identifying where the fuel source of that fire is and reducing it by some percent, that
No, absolutely. And I do see the relevance of that approach. And I think often you see people in the world as it is today, that's structured as it is today, trying to do their moves within that game that are going to lean a bit more into the positive impact they want to make. But the inherent sort of containment within that structure puts a real cap and sometimes corruption on that mission. And that even happens in the spaces of advocacy for political and economic changes. But yeah, fundamentally, I'm with you, and I think about those questions as well. Of, okay, the issue here is the incentive structure. How do we restructure that at its root? Another example might be, it's actually somewhat arbitrary the way that business is structured as a legal entity, that you have CEOs, shareholders, employees, employers, how the decisions are made about where the money goes, how the decisions are made about employee pay, about business decisions. How could you democratize that? Could you have a business that the economic sort of entity, or the political entity, or whatever it is, of a business could be structured completely differently, that it's not a sort of one, that it's less authoritarian and more democratic, that as soon as you're part of a business as an employee or as a staff member or whatever, you are a part of the ownership of the business. Like, it's somewhat arbitrary that that's not the case, and I can imagine that having fundamental changes as well. And when we think about things like, oh, you want to create like what I suggested earlier, you want to create a program to encourage people who are about to be parents or who are young parents to develop certain skills they might not have had access to, or whatever it is. You really need a political context that's going to allow that. There's only so far you can take that, because it's not meeting the incentives of the incentive structure we're in ultimately.
Agreed. And yeah, it's funny that is such a big part of like socialism, is changing how businesses are structured so that employees have a stake in it. And yet, every opponent of socialism that you actually hear being like vocal is just talking about, oh, I don't want everyone to make like the same amount of money and earn the same thing. And yeah, I mean, it almost no one emphasizes that part. It's like, who can really object to that kind of change in how businesses operate, to where it's not just the people at the very top who benefit from the success of the whole company. That's a
Yeah, and if you
clear.
don't want everyone to earn the same, use your voting rights in your business to vote in that direction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It kind of does touch on, because I do think earning, for example, is a valuable concept. I know some visions of utopia have it so that you don't necessarily have to work for anything, because everyone gets the same things in their lives. And I don't think that's what it's about. But I do think, I think the biggest problem with inequality is the fact that some people are at such a low place that they can't even survive. I don't think anyone should have to earn their survival. I don't think food and shelter, these things, I don't think they should be on the table of what you have to work for to earn. I think it should be beyond that. I think we should work to differentiate ourselves. If we care a lot about luxuries and fancy stuff beyond the basics, like, yeah, that's where I think it's fine for us to have to work hard and earn things. And I also think, we've always and probably always will have to work for social approval, for the kind of social outcomes that have always naturally mattered most to us. Before we even had money and possessions, when we were nomadic, the game was always about your social standing, and so that's not going anywhere. But yeah, having to earn your existence on this planet, I think we can do better than that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a bit of I don't know if it's sort of through propaganda or what, but there's certainly a fear people have of any reduction in that, or any change in that capacity to be the person who's on top. It's almost like, well, I don't want to get rid. I mean, this is I'm not speaking for myself really, but this is just sort of an example. But people might say, oh, I don't want to get rid of billionaires or whatever, because I want the option to become that, theoretically, right? Although of course it's always a small minority of people. But as soon as even people who aren't winning in the sort of arbitrary game as we have it structured today, I think they fear the idea of there being any cap on how much they can win or dominate, and I don't know where that comes from. If that's just a psychology thing of a finite pie view, thinking that you have to be above others in order to be doing well. Not sure exactly where that comes from. It certainly seems like a wisdom issue to me. But like, just for example, like in New Zealand, we've just had all this budgeting stuff come out, and the Green Party, and pretty much every country, I think the US is an exception, but most countries have like a Green Party, which is sort of the party that they simultaneously care a lot about environmental issues and social justice issues, or like economic stuff for the less fortunate, I suppose. And she's the leader of the party has presented this economic taxing structure that would reduce or not change taxes for like over 90%. At least this is what she describes. I mean, people probably critique the math, and then increase tax rates for 3% of the population. And they did like an on the street interview, and people are like, wow, how's she going to pay that? I don't want to get taxed more, people. And that it's like that doesn't quite people are afraid of anyone taking what's theirs and what they earn to such a degree that that they seem to miss all the other variables at play, I suppose.
So we do have a Green Party over here, but it's irrelevant because it's not one of the two.
Yeah.
But you're right. There is a real aversion, and a part of it is just classic loss aversion. You don't want to lose what you've already got, and so people who are doing well or plan on doing well will feel threatened by something that would potentially cause them to lose something. But I think it's actually much better understood as an identity issue, because people, when they work to achieve something, and very often, if they have a number to attach to that, then it becomes fused, right? That becomes a part of who they are. And when you threaten to take that away from them, it's not just taking away a material that they've acquired, it's taking away a part of their identity. It's very hard to be successful at something and to do well and to not let that thing become a part of your identity. It's very hard to make a lot of money and not let having a lot of money become a big part of your identity. Anytime you can attach a number to something you achieve, it becomes almost just irresistibly fused to who you are. And you see this in people who earn such a high salary, and they care so much about having it reduced by a small percent, or it's like you've hurt their identity. And like CEOs who make millions and millions per year, they can like get depressed from having their salary reduced because they attached who they are to that number. So I do think it's a wisdom issue, in that people don't have the identity structuring tools that we talk about on Mindform. I mean, I encourage everyone to attach their identity to their virtues rather than outcomes, rather than arbitrary things that you were born with, right? Even the things that are celebrated, like gender and race, it's all about we hear all about taking pride in those things. I would encourage you to gradually work to decrease your pride in things that don't represent your personal virtues. I think that is the best place to localize your identity around your greatest strengths, which very often transfer from one situation to another. If you lived in a world where you were no longer one of the wealthiest people and everyone were just doing okay, right? You still have those skills that allowed you to work your way there. You still have the core part of your identity. You don't have to attach it to that number and that material possession. It's all in here. It's all inside you. You're not actually being threatened if you can structure your identity that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny as well because we already live in a society that's somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, and that's what I find funny. People with one perception of or the other of where we're at see us as being on this side, and any change is a shift away from that. But there are already structures within our society that cap and limit and tax. We have taxes. How much the degree to which everyone gets something and we all get looked after, and it's sort of a socialized, family like collective thing, versus the degree to which it's, everyone for their own, and you get what you earn, and if you don't work or add value according to our current metrics, which are a bit arbitrary, then you don't get, right. That's that we already live in the in betweens, and it's funny how in either direction, I think any shift towards in one area of society towards greater collectivism in that sense, or any shift towards greater individualism, people feel mortified by and horrified by, because they I suppose imagine that we're going to go all the way, But I often think, well, why can't you? People get threatened. Oh, well, shouldn't people be able to get what they earn? It's like, yeah, I agree. Why can't we move a little bit in that direction without completely getting rid of that? It's not the same thing.
And so, I vaguely talked about this one just in terms of not having to earn your existence. But another principle I've talked about is this notion of universal basic needs, as opposed
Oh,
to the
yes.
more common universal basic income. Really, it's all getting at the same general idea that, it's like, I've heard it called like build the floor, like make it so there's no upward limit necessarily, but there is a bottom limit where you can't fall below the point where you can cover, your food and shelter requirements, right? Uh, yeah, and so the idea that I actually think is a little bit better than universal basic income and just giving everyone a check is just kind of identifying these three core institutions which constitute our basic needs as humans, right? There's healthcare, there's housing, and there's hypermarkets, which includes, food and clothes, like
Right.
Walmart over here. Um, if we took the same kind of funding, I think very likely even a little bit less funding that would go into something like universal basic income, or even, a lot of countries' current sort of social systems. If you put that into just completely funding these three institutions, you would essentially take away the possibility for people not to be able to meet their basic needs. And you wouldn't necessarily uh, even threaten those who pride themselves on being way beyond their basic needs. But you would, you create actually a very different world, and very different incentive systems, because so much of the bad that we see in the world is driven by people uh, who aren't who are struggling to meet their basic needs, right? Um,
Mm.
so much crime, the majority of kind of like low level crime is committed uh, because of poverty. Like that's it. And it correlates like perfectly with poverty. So much crime in society would be eliminated if we could do this. And there are so many sort of limits to the way we think in this area. So many things sort of disappear as problems when we all at least know we're going to be able to.
There are, man. I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think a lot of people who are interested in the stuff that we're interested in would agree with you. But one issue that seems to come up for me is that there are, and this is of course an oversimplification, but there are sort of two ways of looking at all of these social issues at a really foundational level. And that's a view of sort of causal interconnectedness of all of these issues, and then a more simple view that I think usually involves quite a bit of moralizing, which is basically, an individual's decisions, and an individual's life outcomes, and all of these things are a result of that individual's character, and that it should be their responsibility to grow that character themselves, and one should not be responsible for anything anyone else does. If you are good and do good, you should get good things, and if you are bad and do bad, you should get bad things, um and that basically, your problems are your problems and my problems are my problems, and that, that's a very, very different view to an appreciation that our childhood has a profound impact on the decisions we make as an adult. Poverty and mental health have a huge impact on crime. Wealth disparity has an impact on social cohesion. All of these things that are well documented sort of statistical phenomena. I think you can acknowledge those facts, and of course we ought to, because they're the reality. But I think a lot of people, we have these moral intuitions, and we perhaps overgeneralize those into the sphere of social issues, or into the sphere of understanding how people work. And we think, oh yes, it may be the case that we might see the statistics that tell us it's the case that your childhood has an impact on what you do as an adult, and all of these things that impact people as I've described. And we might well see as well that the impact that other people not doing well over there has an impact on me. I mean, you can't ignore that as well, that the way we live in our society, other people not being mentally well and being poor actually affects you, because there might be crime around you. Your tax dollars are going to go to looking after those people, or the mistakes that they make, or whatever it is. And people might just, I don't know what's going on there, but do people just look at that reality and say, yeah, but it shouldn't work like that. I shouldn't have to fix those people's problems. It should be that if I do well, I'm good, and if they do bad, they don't, if they naughty or whatever, they get bad outcomes. That's something I always struggle to understand. And that seems to be a real barrier to, I think, most of the things we've discussed here. I think the intuition against that people have, the almost vitriolic reaction people might have in the democratic sphere to some of these ideas, especially institutional changes, comes from a sort of defensiveness of this just patently untrue moral intuition that's sort of been overgeneralized into an understanding of how the world works.
Well, a few things there. So I've written about this this idea of the quadrants in integral theory.
Yes.
And the big distinction I often make is between the individual and the systemic in that context. And people, again, are so inclined towards getting sucked into one of two ideologies, us versus them, that this is a hard one, but if you actually pause and think about it, it's like two things can be true at once on different levels. And so the determinism that you are referencing, the fact that childhood and genetics and all these different layers of influence who you turn out to be and the actions you end up taking, that is objectively true. So I know I've talked before about the sort of quadrant system from Ken Wilber's sort of integral work, and I think it's super relevant here. And people just kind of where they're so inclined to think in terms of these ideological, two-sided debates, that they don't understand there's multiple lenses often to look at these same issues from. So of course you are right that these deterministic realities exist. Of course your genes, of course your upbringing, of course all these things influence where you're at. And on a systemic level, we have to use these things to explain what's going on. But also I think the right response when someone is debating that, when someone is saying, no, you're responsible for all your choices, right? You have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? The right response is really, well, you're right on an individual level. Like, no individual is completely bound by things that happen in their past, right? No one is completely hopeless because they had a tough upbringing and they don't have all the right genes, whatever they've decided. Individuals do have a lot of ability to change their trajectory. So it's not that that's wrong. It's that you're saying it at the wrong time. When we're talking to an individual about what they should do, the answer is you should work really hard. You should take responsibility. You should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, whatever, right? The problem is we're talking on a systemic level, and we can see a pattern where you can't expect that to happen on average across all of society unless you have a solution that's going to reach everyone in society, in which case you're back on the right page where we're talking about ways to change things
Absolutely.
systemically. And the other problem with that is like some people, like probably half of the global population, is just not smart enough to comprehend deterministic interconnected influence. Like it's just literally they're not going to be able to wrap their heads around it. Too many links of cause and effect, and people get lost. And so I think it's a little bit hopeless trying to get everyone to understand that. Uh, but I also don't think you need to. And along those same lines, I think there's a way to make these things appealing to other people too. I mean, consider the fact that people with that kind of mindset very often like, well, we don't want to help people who might be drug addicts, who are homeless, right? Because they're just going to spend that money on drugs, right? And
Sure.
of course, there's a deeper problem with that logic, which is like, well, they're a victim to their drug addiction. They don't want to be addicted to drugs, um, right? But there's sort of another uh, angle you can address too, which is like, okay, with this universal basic needs thing, they can't just take the money and buy drugs because they're not actually getting money. They're just getting access to healthcare, housing, and hypermarkets. So there's no,
Yeah.
you take that element out of it. And so I think a part of designing good systems has to be that it appeals to different demographics of people. It can
I
work on
completely
different
agree.
layers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I mean, this seems to be coming up a lot when we're talking about solving large problems, but it's another example of, you present an imperfect idea, and there's something about the way that we have conversations collectively about ideas. That means that instead of when an imperfect idea is presented, we go, okay, well, here are the problems. How can we manage for those problems? How can we resolve those problems? That's not good. So it's bad. That seems a common occurrence. I mean, you watch political dialogues, right? I'm sure most people have done that before. Watched on the internet or on telly, whatever, political dialogues, and it's so people have an idea and it's flawed. They all are, and the conversation can only ever go so far as that's what's wrong with your side. You have all these problems with your ideas. It's no good. It's stupid, and it's just there's often a bit of straw manning going on as well, from both sides. But it's such a shame that we can't go, okay, so we all have different ideas here, but similar values. Here's an idea. Here's an idea. Oh, okay. Well, here's what I don't like about that. Great. Let's do something, and to have a problem solve. They're not problem solving. That's the issue. They're not problem solving conversations. And I think it comes back a bit to what you were saying. It's identity. It's identity. It's which of these identity groups, which somehow we've wrapped in our identities with political opinions, which one of these identity groups is the good guys and which one's the bad guy? And when people are having these conversations that should be problem solving conversations, that's not what's going on. They're just having a battle of who's on God's side or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. And this is one of those areas where I'm oddly a little bit optimistic in that there's something I like to call superhuman systems sometimes. And we can see a few examples of these, right? The scientific method and peer review, that's just the way the scientific community operates. That's a way of recognizing individually we are flawed. Individually, we're just human, right? But we can design a system that incentivizes kind of countering those biases and systematically reduces the bias, right? You can look at the justice system as another example, or at least how it works in much of the modern world, where we recognize, okay, as individuals, we're all flawed, but we're building in this system where we have this reasonable doubt thing. We assume, you're innocent until proven guilty, even though our inclination is often the opposite. We have all these systems in place. And again, very imperfect. You can point to lots of flaws in the scientific methodologies. You can point to lots of mistakes that are made in the justice system. But still, it's better than any individual human and their biases on their own. And my question is, why are we completely without a superhuman system in the space of discussing society and political conversations, right? We're
Mhm.
completely in the dark ages on that area, because there was a time when science was in the same place. It was just like, you pick an opinion because it sounds good. Oh, I think there's four elements, and I think fire is actually water, and all these things, and there was no system for bringing the best ideas to the top. And now, yes, there are occasionally like scientific views that get politicized and people think they know about them. But as a general rule in society, I think we've gotten pretty good at figuring out, what's true scientifically. Uh, and that's an area where you can you can deny it, but it's still a scientific truth. In this area of society and politics, we just have the identity war going on. There's not a system in place for sorting out what is more likely to happen in society. What's you can take it back to science, but again, I think this is an area where it would require a different type of system that incentivizes different ways of
Absolutely.
thinking. Um, you brought up the back and forth, right? That's and the identity groups and all that, and I think, yeah, some way of breaking people out of those patterns. One of them, right, as a temporary measure, is you kind of have to avoid using any word that is triggering to a particular side, and it goes both ways. That word triggering is kind of associated with one view, but you say the wrong word in the wrong way, and then people are instantly sure they're against that. So you have to stay in this vague middle area where you're sensitive to the perspectives of all sides, and you don't do anything that would cause them to sort of snap into this lower way of thinking, and you keep them in this, well, consider all these different possible outcomes instead of just these two sides. um I think it's unfortunate there's that this is becoming more popular, but it's the idea of like both sidesing. um and you see this sometimes when someone takes this very centrist angle and they say, well, both sides have something going for them. Both sides are right. And it's like, well, no, generally both aren't right, but almost always both are wrong. Like almost always both sides of a two-sided issue have an extremely limited viewpoint. And accusing someone of like both sidesing because they can acknowledge that, it's kind of like the slippery slope thing. There's a slippery slope fallacy, and then there actually are slippery slopes occasionally. And so both sidesing is the same thing. Like there is a fallacy of assuming that both sides are equally right, but also very often there is truth to both sides, and they're just not talking about it in the right way. So fundamentally, yes, I think we need a huge upgrade in how we discuss these types of ideas in society.
It seems like just kind of trying to bring a lot of this stuff together because we've gone in a few different directions around this same topic. It seems like there's obviously a number of leverage points, and what has been happening in this conversation is, as we've talked about one, parenting, for example, we've realized another one. Okay, the shareholder incentive system, and as we've talked about another, wisdom education, changing how people have conversations, yada yada. Well, that's another thing that's come up. Our systems for exchanging ideas collectively and our identity culture, right? So these are all like pressure points. And you also talked about sort of universal basic needs or whatever. That's the issue of, okay, let's come up with not on this side, not on this side, actual pragmatic solutions that's a bit of a win-win. And there's a lot of those. In fact, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in that area, but it's just not the conversation that people seem to be wanting to have. Um, but again, then you can talk about that. Okay, fundamentally, we there are these low-hanging fruit in terms of how we structure society that would make a big difference to these other leverage points like poverty, like education, like yada yada. Um, but there's a leverage point that needs to be resolved for us to make much progress on that, which is our identity politics thinking. So there's a lot of things that seem to be sort of at the root here that affect each other, and um, it's it can feel like, I suppose, that if you're not solving them all simultaneously, you won't get very far on any one. And I suppose for you, you see wisdom education as in more individuals having access to greater wisdom, or sort of being exposed to it as beneficial regardless. And I suppose your area for you to target based on your interests and your skill sets and everything. Um, but yeah, I guess I'm just noticing that that these things really, they all affect each other, and we can only get so far in the wisdom thing without a cultural change, without an economic change, without a political change. Um, so yeah, I don't know. Just what do we do about that? I suppose because it makes it seem very, very difficult.
It does. There are some encouraging aspects of it, though. One is like, yes, every area of society does sort of influence every other area and feeds back into it. That can be a negative in that you're limited from making progress in one area by another area. It can also be a positive in that if you can find a small way to influence one area, it can flow into other areas and feed back in.
True that.
And I also will say, like, personally, I'm more of a like try to really change the world in a measurable way or die trying kind of guy. Some people can find a small area to have influence and feel like they're doing what they need to. I am just constantly coming back to thinking big and asking, how can we do something really big and dramatic? And one of the most plausible ways of doing that is through creating some kind of popular movement, right? And probably one that would be appealing in response to, the chaotic world that it seems like we're in. I mean, arguably, the path we're on as a humanity is leading to somewhere potentially catastrophic, at least some type of collapse, and it probably won't be a full-on human extinction event, whatever it is. And so there will be an opportunity to influence people in a way that you just can't right now, right? That right now people are too locked into the current system. There's too much momentum, but there may be cultural events that just make people more receptive to doing something differently. So that may be an area where there's room for influence. I do think wisdom education is one of those low-hanging fruit areas where there are opportunities. I can see opportunities for me to get in and have that kind of influence. I think the software, if it's designed right, because it just doesn't exist out there, if you can make an app that truly makes it fun to learn how to better operate your mind. I mean, it should be at least as appealing as learning a new language, for example, which is actually a really popular hobby. It's like totally one of the most popular education apps out there is centered around learning a new language. Why can't we make it?
Absolutely. And I think what earlier in this conversation, I was thinking about your app, which I'm very excited about. And when I think about the parenting and component and the influence of the young years, I think I suppose resolving that or dealing with that as adults is in a way a sort of a problem focused approach, right? Like, I got to heal, I got to sort of untraumatize myself, or whatever the language that people use is. And what's really appealing about the sort of psychotechnologies and wisdom approach is that it is a way to target the wisdom issue that isn't too much or disturbing or negative or upsetting for people. It's fun to, I think regardless to some degree of your stance about different issues or your willingness to face yourself, it's fun to develop new skills, especially when they're very specific skills and measurable, and you can see the benefits. And of course, there's the side effect when you're developing skills like, like some of these psychotechnologies you talk about, reframing, mindfulness, etc. There's the side effect that you start dealing with your shit too.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the things that makes me hopeful is the fact that um, I haven't seen it done before. I haven't seen wisdom codified and systematized. I haven't seen
Mhm.
it built into a mastery mechanism, because you're right, people do love learning new skills, but you have to be able to see that progress in order to feel like you're developing that mastery. So really creating a skill system where you can acquire and develop and improve these skills. Collections, people love collectability, right? Wisdom has not been enumerated into a collection of things, right? Community, like yes, in religious spaces, church, there's community centered around wisdom in many cases, but outside of that, I you just don't really see it that often. And so, if we can put all these things that we know people crave into one place, can we make it so that it just becomes addictive to become a better, wiser human being, right? A healthier emotionally person. I think it can be addictive. I think the same mechanisms that make social media platforms and entertainment addictive can be centered around things that will actually make your life a lot better. So I'm
Do you want to give us a bit of the latest on the app? That could be in terms of sort of practical progress or the concept where that's at. But I think the listeners would probably like to hear a little bit about what we're talking about with this app.
Yeah, where to start with the app? I think one thing that has to be recognized is we're currently in a bit of a transformation in the software space where you kind of can't even conceptualize building the most valuable possible app without factoring in how much AI could enhance it, right? There's a lot of talk about the dangers of AI. I think they're very legitimate, but if you were able to remove all the perverse incentives, I think it could be just a transformational tool. And so, uh, yeah, I mean, imagine being able to have a conversation with the system where it can feel out from this conversation which areas you need more training in. And, or you can sort of journal and log about an emotion you experienced, a thought you had that triggered it, and it can come in and intelligently recommend psychotechnologies that you can apply. I mean, if it can identify more quickly than you can your blind spots, your bad mental habits, and then tell you exactly what good habit to replace it with. When you have this kind of thought, here's what you do next time. And combine that with the interval spaced learning and all these other reward mechanisms, and make it so that you can see your growth. You have a dashboard where you're able to track, oh, here's how much progress I made in this domain, right? I'm 20% better at dealing with anger than I was a month ago, right? If you're able to track all these metrics, I mean, we said it before, once you have numbers to attach to
Mm-hmm.
something that you work to earn, it starts getting fused with your identity. And so if we can actually put numbers on some of these things, and that's another one of my concepts is kind of the sapient scoring and how we measure and quantify wisdom, which I think is actually a pretty tractable challenge, right? I do think we can get people to start paying a lot more attention to these things and start caring about them. There are so many elements of gamification that I'm trying to build into this type of app. And in terms of making it happen, there's still a few different ways it can go, but it's very possible that there will end up being a crowdfunding campaign before the end of 2025. It's one of a few different angles, but I think it would be pretty interesting. And I think there are a few ways that we could structure it that would make it really cool and appealing to backers and just exciting. I think that kind of thing, everyone kind of coming together to make something like this happen could really work. And then another possibility, we've got so many software developers on Mindform that we could at least start building some features one by one. And, I've had many of our members reach out at different points and say they'd be interested in doing a hackathon or something to
Oh
make this
yes,
kind of thing happen. So,
that's very that's very exciting, and it's funny. Is it? I wonder what that is that leads. That is. I wonder why there's so many software developers on Mindform. Um,
well, I mean, if you look at the first book, which attracted most people, it's a very techie
yes,
view on psychotecture and all about optimizing psychological algorithms, and it's really a very systematic way of thinking about something that's often treated in this very vague
yeah,
um, way that doesn't have as much clarity. So I think software developers in general find it pretty appealing.
yeah. Well, I think that's another point of power for everything that you're doing around around Mindform, this app, designing the mind, is removing the sort of soft, fluffy, vague uh, approach that generally exists in these sorts of conversations. I think for some reason people, yeah, that's just the way we talk about wisdom, we talk about morality, we talk about um, personal growth, character, all of these things in a very vague and soft and sort of intuitive, I guess, way. Um, and I found since I studied psychology, and sometimes you have conversations with people about, because it's something that's interesting to most people, psychology, and why people do what they do, and you bring in facts basically from psychological research, and it doesn't register as interesting sometimes to people because they see these whole conversations as a space that is more soft or emotional or felt. But what's amazing, there's no reason that psychological growth can't be a very, very spiritual growth, psychological growth, character growth, ethical growth can't be a very acute and specific conversation. And I think creating a space where people can measure that um, and just shifting the conversation a little bit, I can see that having a lot of potential, because I think a huge barrier is that this stuff matters to a lot of people, but they don't have that language to respond to it, and they don't. A lot of people don't yet recognize that that's what's missing as well.
I think you're right, and it's a shame because the whole self help space is kind of looked down upon, frowned upon, because there is so much vague fluff in it. There is a lot of it giving some of it a bad name because right, you look at these intellectuals who won't read a self-help book, and that's kind of below them, and it's like, well, what kind of books are you're reading? What are you trying to learn about that somehow supersedes like living a good life? Like if you're
Mm.
going to be reading nonfiction at all, it seems like that's the biggest most important thing. But of course you think about self-help, and it's generally not really high level like evidence-based stuff that comes to mind. And it's kind of like if the medicine space were completely unregulated and actual medicine were kind of all on the same playing field as like all these alternative medicines, and there were all these you know con artists basically that were given the same status as actual doctors. um you know and you could say that that's how it is now. Some people don't know the difference between Dr. Oz and like an actual doctor, but if you really imagine we eliminated all those regulations and certifications, and we just let anyone claim to be a medicine, a doctor, whatever, then people would start to have a negative view of medicine too. They would lump the whole field together and say, "Oh, medicine doesn't work." It's like, well, there's a a huge this sort of gradient between the stuff that actually works and the stuff that's totally made up. And so that's
Again,
kind of where self-help is.
it's that black and white thinking, isn't it? It's really
Yeah.
foundational, and it's well, you said at the start, didn't you, that that's a real primary target for you in your wisdom education.
The
Yeah,
technologies. So,
through that, yep. I've accessed that one through the oh no, what's it called? The other app attached to Mindform.
Interface app.
The interface app. Yeah, that's right. That's in my collection. Awesome. Well, I think that's probably us for time, Ryan. We've gone through a lot of the stuff, and perhaps we can put a little bit up on the screen, talk to our editor about it, some pictures of the preliminary app ideas as well, and let people get a taste of some of this. This is a complex conversation. I can imagine we could record many more episodes about this, but it's really promising to find one pressure point that you can work on that's going to make a difference. And I mean, that's why I'm part of Mindform. That's why I'm here on the podcast. That's it's a pressure point I believe will make a difference, and it's something I'm pretty glad to be a part of. So,
yeah, me too. You know, I constantly think about how Mindform is just, it's just something I constantly come back to, is like, this feels so important. I love everything about this. You know, when I'm doubting what direction I want to go next, I always come back to that and say, well, it's got to be this, because this is a really beautiful thing. And so I guess what I would say last is join Mindform in January and visit Frank.
Yep. The end of January, Mindform retreat in New Zealand. That's going to be a lot of fun. I've not met any of our members in person yet, including you. So I'm definitely excited about it. Awesome. Well, great chatting to you, Ryan. Thanks for coming on again. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Mindform podcast. I'm Ryan A. Bush, founder and author of Designing the Mind and creator of Mindform. Mindform is an exclusive community and training platform for sculpting your psychological software. Members get access to a group of like-minded psychotechs, including all of our guests on this podcast, gamified growth tools, events and retreats, and a collection of transformative programs for mental health and self-mastery. You can learn more and apply to join at mindform.io/podcast. I hope to see you inside.